When I was 7, my dad took me to see my first movie. It was the premiere of Star Wars at the Arlington Theater in Santa Barbara. I vividly remember that warm May evening. Lines of happy people wrapped around two city blocks. I remember holding my dad's hand, and the excitement was in the air. This was my first movie. I had no idea what to expect. I remember the exact spot where we sat, and I remember how the theater smelled. I remember holding a cold Coca-Cola in my hands that was as big as my head and my first box of red vines. These are two things I could never have. So it was special. And when the lights went down and the music came up and those big yellow letters scrolled across the screen, I was forever changed. I mean, really, my DNA changed. I don't remember much of my childhood, but I remember that night like it happened last night. To say I was hooked would be understating the truth. Movies have given me life ever since. And I loved all the movies, even the bad ones. I loved real Hollywood movies when they were shot on actual film, 70 millimeter Panavision, and shown on screens 30 feet high and 90 feet long. And when they only made 100 to 120 films a year, I had to see every one of them. And as the years went by, movies became my home, my escape. I felt safe and happy in a theater with my Coca-Cola and my red vines, a tradition I have to carry on to this day every time I see a movie. Back then, I was painfully shy. As a kid, my face would turn bright red if you even looked at me. I found my strength, though, in the movies, where I found answers to my questions about who I was and resolutions for my fears. And as the years went by, it became harder for me to communicate with my dad. I wasn't good with words. We slowly grew apart, and I no longer held his hand, and he no longer took me to the movies. When we spent time together, it was in front of the TV. I discovered that this time was actually a gift for us, and the only way I could tell him how I felt was to watch one of my favorite movies with him. And I hope that he understood that the character was me, and that was how I was feeling. My favorite movie during this time was Forrest Gump, and it's still one of my favorite movies today. The opening and the closing scenes say so much without words. I'm going to read from the opening lines in the script right now. Fade in. There's nothing but blue sky, and we see a feather lighter than air, floating like time passing, slowly floating by. And we see it's over a city. A breeze catches it, moving it here and there above the city. It slowly floats down past the buildings. It seems to hover for a moment over a busy sidewalk among the people hurrying by. And it starts to land on a man's head. But as if it had a mind of its own, it changes directions. It starts to land on a woman's shoulder, but it changes its mind again. And taken by a small breeze, it lightly falls and silently lands by chance at this time, at this place, on this street, at a man's feet, wearing dilapidated running shoes, sitting on a bench in Savannah, Georgia. The sound of the wind, the piano keys so sharp, piercing my heart, the beautiful score by Alan Silvestri that is sorrowful and hopeful at the same time, the feather lost in dancing along with the wind, the tilted head of Forrest Gump, his longing look into the distance and remembering his past. This minute of brilliant filmmaking says more about life than I could ever say with words. It is a shared moment in a dark theater and a deeper understanding for all of us that have seen it. Can't you just feel that gentle wind on your face? Remembering the wonderment you had as a child when your favorite book was Curious George and finding a lost feather was a treasure. When I feel most deeply, it is with a film. In the summer of 1993, an army of filmmakers arrived in the Lowcountry of South Carolina, and began to work on the groundbreaking film Forrest Gump. Led by visionary director Robert Zemeckis, his friend and producer Steve Starkey, and the incredible Tom Hanks, the team didn't know at the time that the film would make cinematic history. My special guest today is Steve Starkey, one of the producers of Forrest Gump. Steve has worked alongside of the most influential directors of our generation, including George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Robert Zemeckis. In his new book, Stupid is as Stupid Does, Steve takes us behind the scenes and shares his memories of the unlikely journey to make the Oscar-winning film. Welcome, Steve.
Well, thanks, Jeremiah, for having me. I didn't realize that that films had such an important part of your life, but my gosh, they're certainly part of your DNA.
I'm not kidding. My DNA changed with with watching my first movie and then some. Yeah, I mean, that's more to me than it's as important as life as music. I hold things dear, and film is one, music is another. But film brings all of these things together, doesn't it? Photography and great characters and acting and the human spirit. I mean, it can be so many different things with incredible soundtracks like Forrest Gump has. Steve, do you remember your first movie in a theater?
Gosh, it wasn't anything as as like start. It must have been. I think it was probably like The Absent-Minded Professor or some silly film like that. I don't remember if that was the first, but it was among the first. And like you say, they transport you to a place that a child can't really go in any other way. You go there and sure, you shoot hoops on the basketball court, but when you see these guys bound around, with flubber on their feet, you're just, first of all, you believe it. You actually want to go out and buy some so that you can do the same. In other words, you want to become the characters that you're revering in these pictures. And so whether that was the first picture or not, it's certainly, I have a memory of wanting to be in that movie, wanting to. And so, but that didn't drive me to make movies. That happened later, but I sure loved them.
So The Absent-Minded Professor, you think was your first?
I don't know. I'm just trying to think. It was among the first. Could have been Sound of Music. Could have been. Gosh, I'm not sure. My parents, 101 Dalmatians. I'm not sure.
I remember that one. That was a good one. How did you? When did you get like enthralled? You just loved it for entertainment. You loved it for where it took you in your mind, and like a good story as a kid when your parents read you a book.
Yeah, when you got into to high school, it became part of the conversation. You'd come back to school and people be talking about Cool Hand Luke or Easy Rider or Midnight Cowboy. So and these films were profound. I mean, they really affected you in a way, like opened up worlds that you didn't even know existed. And I'm not talking a fantasy world, part of your real world that you didn't know existed. And so I think that that's started to get my blood turning more and more. Although I still didn't have aspirations to become a filmmaker based on those, I just love movies. And it really didn't happen until probably at as I was going to college and went to screenings at the Pacific Film Archive in Berkeley, where I listened to filmmakers tell stories, not just about their movie, but about making the movie. And I thought, this was a time when, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I thought, my God, this really seems like, first of all, you can be part of making this great story, but you get to go on this adventure with all these other technicians making this film, going to exotic places. And I thought, wow, how does one get to do something as much fun as that? And that, I think, is when it turned over, where I said, I think I'm going to try to figure out how you get into this business of making movies.
It's interesting. I mean, there are some books out there on producing, but when I was in film school in early 2000s at USC, there were Art Linson had a book out, I think, and There was a couple others, but there was never any clear path on what a producer does or how to become a producer, right? I know you were probably in that same, um, dilemma. Like, well, where do I begin? How do I start?
Yeah,
Which we,
I didn't know how movies were made. I mean, I knew that there was a camera you'd seen and you'd heard stories, but I didn't know like what a producer did. I didn't even know what a director did. I thought, they're just actors and you're just,
yeah,
all these other technical crafts contributing to the making of a movie. I had no awareness of. And so when I decided to try to break into the business and went to Los Angeles, I really didn't even know what I was looking for. I was just looking for a job that maybe would then tell me more about the process, I guess, and so it was just by serendipity, that I went to the employment office at Universal Studios and overheard a guy saying that he had just snuck on the lot at Warner Brothers. And I thought to myself, well, if he can sneak on a lot, I can sneak on a lot of Universal. So that's what I did. I went into the back lot of Universal where all the employees parked their cars, and I saw them lining up to take a bus onto the lot. And I parked my car, stood with the rest of them, and took the bus onto the lot.
oh, that's great.
And and then once you get on the bus, it's like, well, where do you get off? And then what do you do? So that was the beginning of that was my introduction to getting my first job in film.
So what did you do? Where did you
Well,
get
what I
up?
did is I stood there and I looked around and I saw one of the sound stages had people milling outside the doors. So I kind of wandered up there and walked onto the sound stage and saw that they were all around a movie set. All the technicians, the camera and the sound people and makeup artists were doing touch up on actors, and all this is new. I had no idea what was going on, but I walked up to each department. I went up to the sound guy and said, so who how do you do this? He said, well, I got a little mixing machine here, and see that guy standing, he's got a big boom and it goes out over and records the sound on the set. And see the woman next to him, she's the cable person who's helping him guide his way and wrangle everything in our department. And I said, well, so is that how you get started in sound? Do you become like the cable person? And she said, yeah, that's usually the entry, or you can go to the sound department here at Universal, and sometimes they need some help in the department. They'll place you on a show. So I did, as soon as somebody tapped on my shoulder and said, excuse me, do you have any business on this stage? And I said, well, not really. And they kicked me off. I started going to the different departments at the studio. And the first department that showed any promise was the electrical department. That's the department that governs the set lighting. So I went in, and there was a tall Texan. His name was Shackelford. And I went up and I said, excuse me, but, how do you get a job in the electrical department? He said, well, son, I get my employees from the union, and sometimes the union goes dry, and when it's dry, we can hire people from the outside. And I said, great. Well, is it dry now? And he said, well, not quite, but there's a big show down in the South called Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and they're taking a lot of electricians down there. I said, okay. And he said, but you keep in touch. So I looked up and I saw the name Shackelford, and I remembered there was this basketball player at UCLA named Lynn Shackelford. And I said to him, you're not any relation to Lynn Shackelford, are you? And he said, well, that's my son. So it turned out I made this connection with the head of the electrical department based on the fact I knew his son played basketball. So he said, well, you keep in touch with me. So every day I came back to the electrical department. And one day he said, come in tomorrow, bring some gloves and a screwdriver and a pair of pliers, and I'm going to put you on stage 32 on Baba Black Sheep. That's how I got my first job.
Oh, that's an amazing story. So every day when you went back, did you sneak on the lot again on the bus? You keep doing the same thing?
On the bus, but now I knew where to get off. I got to the electrical department.
Oh, that's an amazing story. That's great. Oh, so if you could explain why filmmaking is magical to you, Steve. And
well, I think,
before we start talking about Forrest Gump, what is it to you? Is it the same magic feeling? Do you get that same rush that you got when you got on the lot? Do you get that same rush when you work on a great film? Do you still get that today? Do you still have that feeling? And
All I can say, if I relate it to Forrest Gump itself, so we're working really hard on this picture. We know that some scenes are funny. We know that there's scenes that make you cry while you're filming them, but they're just scenes, and you don't know how it's all going to add up. I mean, it was an emotional script, but you don't know how the whole thing's going to add up. And so you get into the editing room and start putting this whole thing together. And so I take it back to the first time I saw the movie as a movie, not as individual scenes. And I sat there and I was with the other producer, Wendy Feineman, and there were tears. I completely got lost in a picture that I had worked on every single scene all day, every day for 6 months. But when the lights went down and that feather fell and the music pulled me in, for some reason, all of the trials of making the film just went away, and I completely committed myself to the movie. And to the end where I had these tears, I remember I called Bob and I said, look, whatever happens with this movie, Bob, I don't know who's going to see it, what's going to happen to it, but whatever happens, I am so proud that you had me working on this movie, because I had such a emotional experience watching the movie. So sort of the answer is, movies, despite the fact people often say to me, like, well, you know so much about the craft of making movies, does that put you at a distance, when you're watching a film? And I say, not at all. If movies are working, that's all I'm completely involved in the film, and and it's got a huge emotional impact. Now, if the movie's not working, I tend to start listening to the music, or I start watching the camera moving, or other things start coming into my head. But boy, when a movie is firing on all cylinders, I'm the best audience you could ever have.
yeah, and when it takes you away like Forrest Gump does, oh my God, where you just it's true that the scenes. Okay, so let me back up. So this morning I'm preparing for the show and getting some clips together. So I start watching just clips, 1 minute to 3 minutes clips, favorite clips out of Forrest Gump. And I'm kind of embarrassed. I'll admit this. I was getting teary eyed. I was getting emotion. They emotionally drew me in less than a minute. And when you put the whole film together and you watch that whole film, when it's over, it's like you got hit by a big wave and you're tingly, your body's tingling and your mind's going, and you're like, it takes you a minute to come back to the real world.
Yeah, you
Forrest Gump
really need
does
to,
that.
maybe the credits at the end of movies are good because they allow you a buffer zone from that movie state of mind to reality where you get to
Yeah.
what just happened to me?
Well, congratulations for giving such a great movie to us, to the world. I mean, Forrest Gump is, like I said, my favorite, maybe my favorite. I don't know, but I haven't put them in order. But Forrest Gump's in there in that top five for sure, if not up at the top. It's movie making at its best. And you mentioned, you weren't sure. We're going to talk about it in the next segment here. You weren't sure how the film was going to be received. I know you struggled as a producer with the studios, and there was just incredibly challenging circumstances for you to overcome as a producer and as filmmakers with the team. At the end, though, this must have felt so good. 678.2 million in US dollars in the United States. Robert Zemeckis directed film grossed 330 million domestically, actually 678.2 million worldwide, including releases. It was the highest grossing film of 1994, and you guys won 6 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Actor for Tom Hanks. Amazing! Congratulations again on that. It still got to feel so good, I'm sure. Let's take a real quick.
Well, thanks. But we certainly didn't know what was coming. I'll tell you
Yeah.
that.
Right. I mean, it's such a leap of faith and a labor of love, I guess, that you put it all, you left it all out there on the field, as they say. Okay, so Steve Starkey, He's my special guest today. He's a producer on Forrest Gump, Castaway, Back to the Future, maybe different credits and different titles, but he's worked on all of these great films. Contact, I told you last time I saw you, Steve, was one of my favorite. And I think you said to me, if I remember correctly, I wish it was everybody else's.
Yeah.
that I didn't know it maybe it didn't do so well in the box office, but I love that film. And um, Steve's here to talk about his new book, Stupid is as Stupid Does. The Unlikely Journey of a Producer on Forrest Gump. It was released in August. The author, Steve Starkey, my special guest, it's got a foreword by Tom Hanks. And you can get it anywhere you get your books. Steve takes you behind the scenes and shares his memories of the unlikely journey to make the Oscar-winning film. You can find Steve Starkey on Instagram. Is that okay if I give out your address, Steve? Or are you Steve Starkey1 on Instagram? IMDb, you can find and look at all of Steve's credits, Steve Starkey. But I will warn you, you will continue scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and looking at one after another of your favorite films. It's great to see all the great pictures that you've been involved in. We'll be right back. This is the Jeremiah Show. We're talking with Steve Starkey.